are joined on the line now by former White House press secretary to U.S. President George W. Bush, Ari Fleischer. Good morning to you, Ari.
Good morning, guys.
It's good to have you on the program. Look, we wanted to bring you in because there's been a lot of stuff that's been coming out lately about the Obama administration, and we wanted to know, are we just, sort of naive, or does this kind of stuff go on all the time, or is this exceptional? Let me start out by asking you about this thing with Tim Geithner. So Tim Geithner's got a book that's coming out, former Secretary of the Treasury. He says, look, I remember a Roosevelt room prep session before I appeared on a Sunday show, and Dan Pfeiffer said he didn't want me to say that Social Security didn't contribute to the deficit. He goes on, and I'll just sort of shorthand this thing, goes on to say, well, it's not the primary thing, but it does contribute, and I didn't want to say it. And so I wondered, do you have people in the White House who tell not elected officials, but appointed officials like the Secretary of the Treasury to go out and tell untruths on national TV? Is that standard operating procedure?
Well, look, not to defend the Obama administration, which I won't do, but when you say that tell untruths, no, nobody goes out and you think would tell somebody to say something untrue. They're going to give the reaction that the Secretary of Treasury gave here. No, I won't say that. But it is the job of White House staff, and I used to do it. Others did it, and administrations before me they did it, and they'll do it in administrations after President Obama, to tell presidential appointees what it is the White House wants them to say when they go on the air. That's part of what we call message discipline. Now, where the rubber hits the road is what exactly are you asking them to say? If you're asking them to make up a fact about, for example, that a protest outside a consulate in Benghazi was caused by a YouTube video because that's the message the White House wants, that crosses the line because it's not based on anything that's truthful. You can't do it. You shouldn't do it. And if somebody like Susan Rice, the United Nations ambassador, actually goes on the air and says it, she's going to take the heat and look bad, and the White House will too.
So when you saw that Ben Rhodes memo that said that we want to make the case that this is rooted in an Internet video and not a failure of policy, what did you think?
My reaction was nobody in the Bush administration would write something like that unless the CIA, the people with the information or the knowledge, wrote it themselves. The White House is not the finder of facts. The White House is the emphasis that you want to put on an issue. That's the president's prerogative, and it's the prerogative of his staff to work with cabinet secretaries and other newsmakers to get that on the air. But you can't invent facts, and that's where you have to rely on the accuracy of government data or government findings, and then the White House staff can put an emphasis on X, de-emphasize Y, etc. But, on the question about Social Security, good for Tim Geithner. He was asked to go too far. Everything contributes to the deficit, and so it's always an arguable point about which item contributes the most or the least to the deficit. And he pushed back. But it is a routine part of what the White House does with cabinet secretaries to ask them to emphasize the things that the White House wants to ask to say. And there's nothing wrong with that unless you go too far and you say something that's not true.
Ari Fleischer, there's another thing that Jay Carney does that really drives us up the wall. And I just want to be fair. I want to bounce it off you. You tell me if this is a normal practice. Seems like Jay Carney will comment on anything he wants to, Justin Bieber, whatever, except when there's an uncomfortable question that may not be directly related to the White House. He says, well, I would refer you to the State Department on that. I would refer you to the Treasury Department on that. I would refer you to the FBI on that. So let me ask you one very specific, because I don't remember you doing that, Ari. But here's one yesterday. Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden. And last time I checked, Joe Biden he hangs around the White House quite a bit. He might be the White House's problem. And Hunter Biden has now been hired as a board member for Ukraine's largest gas producer. Obviously, this has some international ramifications. John Carl asks him about this yesterday at the briefing, and I kid you not, Jay Carney's response was, I would refer you to the vice president's office. I mean, isn't it his job to speak on this?
Well, his job is sometimes to duck and to dodge and to defer. And I have to tell you, I used to do it myself. I was asked questions about the vice president, and I'd say I refer you to the vice president's office. Here's the problem if you're the press secretary. You're held liable for anything and everything that happens anywhere and everywhere in the government. And there are some times when you legitimately do not know the answer, and you should refer it to the people who are more positioned to know the answer. It's also training for the White House press corps. If they can get the answer to everything from the White House, They will never ask questions to the people who are actually in charge of the programs at the various agencies. And no White House press secretary wants to be in charge of everything the agencies are doing because you just physically can't. You can't keep up. And so deferring or referring to the appropriate place can be right. The White House press secretary speaks for the president. That's the job. Now, of course, there's an ancillary part of it that involves the vice president, but frankly, it is the press secretary's prerogative to pick and choose and decide when to defer and when to take the question.
All right, but let me just see if I can take one more swing at this thing, because I'm bothered by the 1-2 punch here. Okay, so you have Geithner writing a book in which he says, I stated something during a prep session, and they asked me not to say it. They said, don't do that. Now, what he said in the prep session was accurate. It had to do with Social Security and the deficit. They asked him not to say it. He said, no, I can't go out there and not say that. It would be intellectually dishonest, and it would not be the truth. And they went back to him and said, well, we're trying to have what they called a dog whistle to the left. We want to send the message by not saying this to the left that we're not coming after Social Security, so it's a dog whistle. He was completely offended by this. Okay, so here you have an incident where a guy makes a statement that is true, and he's told not to say it. And then you have over here on the Benghazi thing a memo from a guy who says, we want this to be about the video and not about any failure of policy on the part of the Obama administration. It seems to me that in both of these cases, what you're asking the elected official to do, Tim Geithner in one case, Susan Rice in the other, is to be deceptive.
I agree with that. And that's why I said when the rubber hits the road, you can't ask people to do things that are factually wrong or go too far. Geithner did the right thing. He pushed back and refused to do it. Susan Rice should have done that as well, but she just buckled under and went along, and that's why they're in so much trouble, because they weren't forthcoming from the beginning. But it's okay if the White House has said to Tim Geithner, we want you to emphasize that health issues are the driving factor in the deficit. We prefer for you to talk about Medicare and Medicaid. Don't bring up Social Security. Emphasize those two. I think that's something that could have been a legitimate request, and Geithner could have done it. But to say Social Security does not contribute would be wrong, and that's where they went too far.
Ari Fleischer, real fast, there were times when you were under fire from the press about some issues during the Bush administration. You may recall one or two moments.
Only on days that ended in Y.
And I wonder how much you would have loved to have NBC's Chuck Todd back then take this kind of angle with regard to Benghazi. He said this yesterday with regard to the Benghazi hearings.
I'll hear from Republicans that say, but there are unanswered questions. Well, no, all the questions have been answered.
How many people in that press room just sort of shrugged and said, okay, Ari's answered all our questions?
Yeah, I think you just put your finger on the big difference. With the Bush administration, I think it's fair to say with almost any Republican administration, the press starts pounding and they're skeptical from the beginning. It took almost 4 to 5 years for the press to turn on President Obama, and then they only did a partial turn. And it's really because ideologically and temperamentally, the press is more inclined to agree with a Democratic agenda than a Republican agenda. They can be cynical, they can be tough, but frankly, when the two parties fight, the press does take more of one side than the other. And you know what the event was that got the White House press corps initially really spun up and the first time burst out against the White House? Is when the president played golf with Tiger Woods and they did not let the press corps go.
I know.
That's
right.
the event.
It was a turning point. You're right.
Think of all the selfies they missed out on.
Now you've gone too far.
That was what started it. And then you had a series of scandals in a row with the IRS, with the Justice Department, with subpoenas to reporters, and you had several in a row, and that got the press corps going. But it took 4.5 to 5 years.
All right, Ari Fleischer.
It was like that right from the beginning.
We got to leave it there. It's always so informative to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Please come back. We love having you on.